September 1st, 1943. Rabaul Airfield, New Britain. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai's hand paused over the intelligence briefing, his solitary functioning eye, the other having been lost to American sharpshooters a year prior, scanning words that evoked an audible laugh within the stifling operations tent. The Americans, it seemed, had engineered a new aerial combatant, possessing the bulk of a bomber and the span of a transport aircraft. They had christened it the Hellcat. Our intelligence indicated its mass to be double that of our Zero. This, they surmised, represented another misstep in American engineering. Through the tent's openings, he could observe his squadrons of A6 arrayed upon the perforated steel plating. Elegant, agile, and lethal. For a span of 2 years, these machines had been the undisputed rulers of the Pacific firmament. British Hurricanes, American P-40s, Dutch Brewster Buffaloes, all had succumbed to the guns of the Zeros. This latest American endeavor, this corpulent Hellcat, would prove no different. What Sakai was unaware of, what none of the Japanese naval aviators preparing for their morning briefing knew, was that in precisely 30 days, this supposed failing would initiate the systematic eradication of Japanese naval aviation. The F6F Hellcat would achieve a remarkable conquest ratio of 19-1, annihilating 5,223 enemy aircraft while surrendering merely 270 in aerial engagements. It would fundamentally alter the dynamics of carrier warfare, shatter the might of Japanese air power, and definitively prove that the Zero's reign of dominance had been erected upon a bedrock of critical miscalculations. The equations governing aerial supremacy were on the cusp of being dramatically redefined by an aircraft that appeared ungainly, flew with considerable inertia, and seemed to defy every principle the Japanese had so meticulously refined. Yet, within a mere 6 months, the very pilots now scoffing at the intelligence reports would find themselves penning final dispatches home, acutely aware that an encounter with the Hellcats signified a statistical certainty of demise. The apogee of the rising sun. The Japanese Navy's self-assurance in September 1943 was not born of hubris, but of meticulous calculation. Since December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service had registered victory margins that strained credulity. At Pearl Harbor, they sustained 29 aircraft losses while eliminating 347. In the Philippines, 7 losses against 103 destroyed over Darwin, 2 losses versus 30. The air arm of the British Far East Fleet was utterly annihilated. The Dutch East Indies Air Force was extinguished within days. At the heart of this overwhelming ascendancy flew the Mitsubishi A6, an aircraft that had fundamentally rewritten the paradigms of fighter design. Upon the acquisition and subsequent testing of captured examples by American engineers in 1942, they initially struggled to accept the reported performance metrics. A fighter possessing the operational range of a bomber, the agility of a biplane, and the offensive capability to neutralize any adversary it pursued. It seemed almost inconceivable. Warrant Officer Hiroyoshi Nishiwa, who would ultimately ascend to the status of Japan's premier ace with 87 confirmed aerial victories, eloquently described the Zero in his recovered personal log. "To pilot the Zero," he wrote, "is akin to being bestowed with wings. The aircraft responds to one's very thoughts, transcending mere control inputs. American aircraft, in contrast, handle like lumbering trucks. Powerful, yes, but inherently clumsy. They fashion their fighters much like they construct their automobiles. Heavy, excessively reinforced, and inefficient." The Zero's extraordinary performance was a direct consequence of its revolutionary design philosophy. The utilization of extra super duralumine, a classified aluminum alloy, resulted in an airframe that was 30% lighter than comparable American designs. The pilot lacked any armored protection. Self-sealing fuel tanks, which would have added considerable weight, were omitted. Even the radio was frequently removed to shave off precious ounces. Every gram was sacrificed in the relentless pursuit of superior performance, the dismissal of intelligence. Initial accounts of the F6F Hellcat reached Japanese intelligence channels through neutral Swedish channels in the early months of 1943. The provided specifications appeared more akin to propaganda or perhaps deliberate strategic disinformation. The aircraft, when fully loaded, reportedly weighed 12,186 pounds. The Zero, in comparison, weighed merely 5,800 pounds. Its wingspan measured 334 square feet, driven by a drag-inducing radial engine. It was equipped to carry 2,400 rounds of ammunition, featured armor plating throughout, incorporated bulletproof glass, and housed self-sealing tanks capable of holding 250 gallons of fuel. Captain Minoru Genda, the tactical mastermind behind the Pearl Harbor assault, meticulously reviewed these specifications at the Combined Fleet headquarters. His assessment, preserved within the Japanese Defense Archives, was decidedly dismissive. The Americans, he concluded, had learned nothing. This Hellcat, he believed, represented a perpetuation of their flawed approach, an attempt to compensate for a deficiency in pilot skill with sheer mechanical might. A Zero, he confidently asserted, could easily outmaneuver it in a turning engagement. The available data appeared to corroborate his evaluation. The Zero's wing loading of 22 pounds per square foot granted it a turning radius of 612 feet. The Hellcat's wing loading, calculated at 36.5 pounds per square foot, suggested a turning radius exceeding 900 feet. In a turning engagement, the very cornerstone of all Japanese fighter tactics, the Hellcat would, by all accounts, be rendered impotent. The initial sighting, September the 30th, 1943. Marcus Island. Petty Officer First Class Yoshio Fukui was engaged in an escort mission for a reconnaissance flight when his attention was drawn to them. 6 dark blue shapes ascending from the southeast. His initial thought, as recorded in his subsequent after-action report, was that they were B-25 bombers operating on an unusual vector. Then they maneuvered, and he recognized the unmistakable silhouette. A single engine, a bulbous fuselage, and wings that seemed disproportionately small for its body. First encounter with F6F type fighter, he would later write. Initial impression, Americans have mounted fighter guns on a torpedo bomber, engaged with standard tactics. Standard tactics, in this context, involved leveraging the Zero's superior turning rate to gain a position on the enemy's tail. Fukui initiated a diving turn, anticipating that the heavy American fighter would maintain its forward trajectory, allowing him to curve onto its 6 o'clock position. Instead, an unforeseen event transpired. The Hellcat did not retreat. It made no attempt to match his turn. It ascended vertically. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, producing 2,000 horsepower, 700 more than the Zero's Nakajima engine, which delivered 1,130 horsepower, propelled the Hellcat upward at an astonishing rate of 3,500 feet per minute. Fukui, attempting to pursue, witnessed his airspeed diminish drastically as the Zero struggled against the forces of gravity. At 15,000 feet, the Hellcat executed a maneuver that seemed impossible for its considerable weight, a hammerhead turn that brought it directly onto Fukui's tail. The American opened fire at 400 meters, Fukui reported. 6 machine guns, not the 4 we anticipated. The volume of fire was unprecedented. My aircraft sustained 17 hits in 3 seconds. I only escaped by dropping into a spin. Fukui survived, barely managing to return to Marcus Island with his Zero heavily damaged, riddled with holes. His wingman, Petty Officer Second Class Masao, did not return. Neither did the reconnaissance aircraft they were assigned to protect. First blood to the Hellcat, the weight paradox. October the 5th, 1943. Task Force 14 launched an assault on Wake Island. Lieutenant Yoshio led 12 Zeros from the 252nd Air Group to intercept what initially appeared to be another minor incursion. American carriers had been conducting these hit-and-run attacks for months, typically retreating before Japanese fighters could mount a substantial engagement. This occasion, however, would prove markedly different. "We climbed to 20,000 feet, Shiga recorded in his personal journal. Below us, 12 F6F fighters in 3 formations. We held every conceivable advantage. Altitude, position, surprise. Victory was assured. The ensuing engagement, however, would fundamentally shatter established Japanese tactical doctrine. As the Zeros commenced their dive upon the Hellcats, the American fighters did not scatter or attempt evasive turning maneuvers. They maintained their formations, accelerating into a shallow dive that preserved their energy levels. When the Zeros unleashed their fire from maximum range, hoping for a fortunate hit, the Hellcats simply absorbed the incoming ordnance. The Hellcats' defensive armament included 212 pounds of armor plating protecting the pilot, 110 pounds safeguarding the oil system, and self-sealing fuel tanks capable of withstanding dozens of impacts. As the Zeros expended their ammunition in their diving passes, the Hellcats initiated their counterattack. Rather than engaging in turning dogfights, they weaponized their superior mass. Ascending at full throttle, they reached altitudes where the Zero's engine struggled for adequate oxygen. At 25,000 feet, the Hellcat still produced 1,650 horsepower, whereas the Zero's output had diminished to a mere 900. "They descended upon us like hawks upon sparrows," Shiga lamented. "Their weight granted them a velocity we could not match. They would dive, unleash those 6 formidable guns, then climb away before we could mount a defense." 8 Zeros were shot down. No Hellcats were lost. The Marianas Turkey Shoot Prophecy, November 11th, 1943. Rabaul. The assembled pilots of the 204th Air Group listened intently as Lieutenant Commander Tao Tanemizu briefed them on emergent American aerial tactics. Tanemizu, credited with 32 aerial victories, was one of the few pilots who had survived multiple encounters with the Hellcats. "Forget everything you believe about aerial combat," he implored them. "The Americans have fundamentally altered the rules of engagement. They no longer engage on our terms. They fight like executioners, not warriors." Tanemizu proceeded to elucidate the grim reality that Japanese pilots were slowly and fatally beginning to comprehend. The Hellcat was not engineered to outmaneuver the Zero in a turning contest. It was designed to render such maneuvers entirely unnecessary. Employing a combat doctrine termed energy fighting, Hellcat pilots meticulously maintained their airspeed and altitude, strategically converting potential energy into kinetic energy through slashing attack runs that offered Zero pilots no opportunity to exploit their superior maneuverability. "They operate in coordinated pairs," Tanemizu continued, "one maintaining a higher altitude, the other a lower position. While you engage one, the other is already initiating a dive upon your vulnerable position. Their radios, which we so readily dismissed as unnecessary weight, enable them to coordinate their actions with unparalleled precision. We fly as individual samurai, they fight as a unified machine." The Technological Chasm, December 1943. Truk Lagoon. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had orchestrated the devastating Pearl Harbor assault, now served as the air operations officer for the combined fleet. His inspection of damaged Zeros returning from engagements with Hellcats starkly illuminated the widening technological disparity. The difference in offensive firepower was mathematically staggering. The Hellcats' 6 Browning M2 machine guns fired 750 rounds per minute each, yielding a collective rate of 4,500 rounds per minute. Each 50 caliber projectile weighed 46 grams, traveled at 2,900 feet per second, and delivered 3,500 foot-pounds of kinetic energy. In contrast, the Zero's 2 7.7mm machine guns fired projectiles weighing 11 grams at 2,300 feet per second, delivering a mere 750 foot-pounds of energy. Even more disconcerting were the reports of American radar-guided fighter direction capabilities. While Japanese pilots continued to rely on visual identification to detect enemy aircraft, Hellcat pilots were guided to their targets by shipboard radar controllers who possessed the ability to track Japanese aircraft from a distance of 50 miles. Lieutenant Sadamu Kumachi recounted his inaugural radar-directed interception. "We were ascending through clouds when they struck us. There was no warning, no visual contact. Hellcats diving from above, precisely on our trajectory, positioned with uncanny accuracy. They knew our exact location, our altitude, and our course. We were like blind men fighting those who could perceive the darkness." The Pilot Equation, January 1944. The crisis within the Japanese pilot corps was escalating to catastrophic levels. The pre-war Imperial Navy pilot training program had been globally recognized as the most rigorous and demanding. Training typically spanned 3 years, with pilots entering combat engagements possessing an average of 700 flight hours. Army pilots received a minimum of 500 hours. They were, in essence, virtuosos of aerial combat, meticulously trained in aerobatics, marksmanship, and the profound spiritual philosophy underpinning air warfare. By the early months of 1944, however, Japanese naval pilots were being deployed into combat with a mere 300 flight hours, while Army pilots had as few as 200. Critically, fuel shortages meant that the majority of training was conducted using gliders. Gunnery practice was severely restricted to 50 rounds per pilot. Essential elements such as formation flying, instrument flight, and radio procedures were summarily eliminated to expedite the deployment of pilots to the front lines. Concurrently, American pilots were arriving with a minimum of 300 hours of flight time, including 50 hours specifically in their assigned aircraft type. They had expended thousands of practice rounds, mastered carrier landings through relentless repetition, and honed their energy tactics in the relative safety of Texas airfields. Lieutenant Commander Yoshihiro Hashimoto, serving as the training officer at Kasumigaura Naval Air Station, articulated the grim reality in his final report. "We are dispatching children to confront seasoned professionals." He cited a recent case. "Yesterday, Ensign Yamamoto arrived at the front. He had never discharged his guns in flight. We lack ammunition for practice. He had never undertaken night flights. We possess no fuel for such training. He survived only 7 minutes in his initial combat engagement." The Formosa Revelation, October 12th to 16th, 1944. The Battle of Formosa. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukutome, commander of the 2nd Air Fleet, committed every available resource in a desperate attempt to thwart the American carrier raids on Formosa. Over 700 aircraft, including the last remaining well-trained pilots from the homeland training squadrons, were deployed. The Japanese publicly proclaimed a spectacular victory, reporting the sinking of 26 carriers and battleships and the destruction of 300 aircraft. The stark reality, however, only emerged after pilots returned and gun camera footage was meticulously developed. A catastrophic outcome. Actual American losses amounted to 89 aircraft. Japanese losses, conversely, tallied 329 aircraft, and tragically, nearly every experienced pilot. Lieutenant Sadaki Akamatsu, one of the few surviving veterans, poignantly described the brutal slaughter in his memoirs. "The Hellcats were positioned at every conceivable altitude. As we ascended, they were positioned above us. As we dove, they were waiting below. They had meticulously divided the sky into discrete sectors, each section covered by a dedicated formation. It was not combat. It was a systematic extermination." The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, June 19th, 1944. The Philippine Sea. The Japanese Navy committed its painstakingly reconstituted carrier force to Operation Ago, a decisive engagement intended to obliterate American carrier power in the Pacific. 9 carriers, carrying 450 aircraft, piloted by their most capable remaining aviators, were deployed. In opposition stood Task Force 58, comprising 15 carriers and 956 aircraft, 450 of which were the formidable F6F Hellcats. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa launched his strike formations in 4 waves, confident that Japanese pilot skill and the Zero's superior range advantage would ultimately prevail. The initial wave, consisting of 69 aircraft, took to the air at 0830. American radar detected them at a distance of 150 miles. Hellcats were vectored for interception with impeccable positional accuracy. They possessed the altitude advantage, the sun at their backs, and approached from the Japanese aircraft's blind spots. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, leading the fighter escort, sighted the Hellcats mere minutes before the engagement commenced. They were stacked from 20,000 to 30,000 feet, he later reported. At least 60 of them, waiting like a steel curtain. We were at 18,000 feet. Every advantage was theirs. The engagement lasted a mere 12 minutes. Of the 69 Japanese aircraft launched, 42 were shot down. Commander David McCampbell, Commander Air Group 15, personally achieved 7 aerial victories on that single day. His wingman, Lieutenant Roy Rushing, accounted for 6 more. The Zeros attempted to turn with us, McCampbell recounted. We simply refused. We would execute a high side run, dispatch one, then zoom climb back to altitude. They would attempt to follow, stall out, and another Hellcat would pick them off. By the day's end, the Japanese had sustained losses of 346 carrier aircraft, in addition to 50 land-based aircraft. American losses totaled merely 30 aircraft from all causes. American pilots in their ready rooms that evening coined the term turkey shoot, a reflection of the enemy aircraft's utter helplessness, akin to defenseless game birds. The Leyte Gulf Record. October to 24th, 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Commander David McCampbell would establish his singular mission record during this monumental engagement. Leading a formation of 7 Hellcats from the USS Essex, he intercepted a formidable force of 60 Japanese aircraft converging on the American fleet. In the ensuing 90-minute battle, McCampbell personally shot down 9 enemy aircraft, 5 Zeros and 4 bombers, while his wingman, Roy Rushing, destroyed an additional 6. I ran out of ammunition after the 9th kill, McCampbell recorded in his debrief. The Hellcat performed flawlessly throughout the engagement. Not a single hit was registered on my aircraft, despite being outnumbered 8-1. This engagement unequivocally demonstrated a complete reversal of air superiority. 7 Hellcats had effectively routed 60 Japanese aircraft, destroying 15 without sustaining a single loss. McCampbell's 2 ace-in-a-day performances, 7 kills on June 19th and 9 on October the 24th, earned him the nation's highest military honors, the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross. The psychological collapse. The aftermath of the battles in the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf precipitated what Japanese military psychologists would later term Hellcat psychosis among the surviving pilots. Admiral Ozawa, in his official after-action report, lamented, "The enemy's radar-guided fighter direction achieved something we deemed impossible, the industrialization of aerial combat." Each Hellcat was not an independent fighter, but an integral component within a vast, interconnected system. Our pilots, irrespective of their individual skill, were not engaging individual aircraft, but rather an overwhelming technological apparatus. The pilot shortage became so dire that by early 1945, training was reduced to a mere 40 to 50 hours for naval pilots and 60 to 70 hours for Army pilots. Kamikaze pilots received a total of only 40 to 50 hours of training, approximating 7 days. The Okinawa Apocalypse, April to June 1945. Operation Iceberg. The Japanese launched in staggering 1,900 kamikaze sorties against the American fleet operating off the coast of Okinawa. The Hellcat evolved from a mere fighter into a crucial defender against the sheer desperation of these seaside attacks. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia, leading his renowned Flying Circus division of Hellcats, achieved an astounding 23 aerial victories during the campaign. His innovative tactical employment of divisions of 4 aircraft in highly coordinated attacks rendered traditional Japanese fighter tactics suicidal. "We developed what we called the mowing machine tactic," Valencia explained. 4 Hellcats flying in a line abreast, spaced approximately 100 yards apart, would sweep through Japanese formations at high speed, Each pilot was responsible for covering his designated sector. We would execute one pass, then climb back to altitude and repeat the maneuver. The mathematical realities of the Okinawa campaign were stark and undeniable. Hellcats flew 38,038 combat sorties, claiming 2,351 victories against a mere 249 losses, resulting in an impressive 9.5 to 1 kill ratio. More significantly, they were instrumental in preventing approximately 80% of incoming kamikaze aircraft from reaching their intended targets. The technological chasm. By 1945, the technological disparity between the combatants had become an unbridgeable gulf. The F6F Hellcat incorporated a series of significant improvements that rendered it even more lethal. Water injection boosted engine power to 2,200 horsepower, zero-length rocket launchers were integrated, armor protection was enhanced, and the K-14 computing gun sight was introduced, automatically calculating deflection for more accurate targeting. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, Japan's legendary ace with 28 officially recognized victories, though modern historians estimate his true tally closer to 50, encountered Hellcats for the first time in June 1944. Despite his formidable skill and extensive experience, he narrowly escaped death in his initial engagement. "I performed my utmost aerobatics," he wrote in his autobiography, "loops, rolls, splits S. Every maneuver I had perfected over 200 previous combats." The Hellcat followed with ease, almost with casual indifference. "I survived solely because the American pilot committed an error. He neglected to release his drop tank before initiating combat." The human cost accounting. By the war's conclusion, the F6F Hellcat had destroyed 5,223 enemy aircraft in aerial combat, sustained losses of 270 aircraft to enemy fighters, achieving an astounding 19.3 to 1 kill ratio. It produced 305 USs, Navy aces, and accounted for 75% of all Navy air-to-air victories. The human toll for Japan was nothing short of catastrophic. Of the 18,000 naval aviators who had commenced the war, fewer than 100 combat-experienced pilots remained by August 1945. The kamikaze equation. The transformation of Japanese naval aviation from an elite force into a proponent of kamikaze operations represented the ultimate concession of Hellcat superiority. Unable to compete through conventional means, Japan resorted to transforming its pilots into guided missiles. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, often referred to as the father of the kamikaze program, justified this desperate strategy with stark mathematical reasoning. If a Zero attacks a carrier conventionally, the probability of success is near zero. The Hellcats will undoubtedly destroy it. However, if the Zero becomes a bomb, the probability of a successful hit increases to 30%. The pilot will perish in either scenario. At least as a kamikaze, his death possesses meaning. On October 25, 1944, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa escorted the inaugural official kamikaze mission, led by Lieutenant Yukio Seki. In the process, he claimed his 86th and 87th victories, downing 2 F6F Hellcats. The very next day, October 26, 1944, Nishizawa met his end as a passenger aboard a transport aircraft that was shot down by Hellcats from VF-14. Japan's most celebrated ace, rendered helpless without his fighter, fell victim to the very aircraft he had once briefly outmatched. The final testimony, August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito's broadcast announcing Japan's surrender echoed across the nation. At Atsugi Airfield, Captain Minoru Genda, who had so readily dismissed the Hellcat as a crude embodiment of excessive weight over refined finesse, listened intently to the Emperor's somber words. Around him sat the shattered remnants of Japanese naval aviation. Teenage pilots with a mere 40 hours of flight time, aircraft pieced together from salvaged parts, and fuel tanks running perilously empty. On that same day, Ensign Clarence Moore of VF-31, flying from the USS Bellows, shot down a Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber shortly after 2 o'clock in the afternoon, marking the final aerial victory of World War II. The Japanese pilot, apparently unaware of the surrender, was approaching the American fleet when Moore intercepted him. Two brief bursts from the Hellcat's 6 guns brought a definitive end to the Pacific Air War. The occupation's turning point. September 1945, Atsugi Airfield. 12 F6F Hellcats from the USS Yorktown were the inaugural American aircraft to touch down following the surrender. Japanese aviators, ground crews, and maintenance personnel lined the tarmac, observing their adversaries up close. Lieutenant Robert Vasu, an American pilot with 19 aerial triumphs and a decorated ace, showcased the Hellcat's formidable capabilities to the assembled Japanese pilots. His effortless aerial maneuvers, loops, rolls, and steep climbs, maneuvers that would have easily overwhelmed a Zero, left them utterly silenced. "You must grasp this," Vasu conveyed through an interpreter. "This isn't even stretching its limits. In combat, with water injection, it possesses 20% greater power. The aircraft is engineered to withstand 13 Gs. I have never managed to break one." The engineering post-mortem. Following the war, Japanese engineers examining captured Hellcats uncovered the full scope of American industrial prowess. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine comprised 2,840 precision-engineered components, each perfectly interchangeable with any other R2800 engine. Conversely, the Nakajima Sake required meticulous hand-fitting of its parts. No two engines were precisely identical. Professor Jiro Horikoshi, the brilliant designer of the Zero, conducted an extensive post-war study of the Hellcat. His assessment proved profoundly disheartening. "We engineered an aircraft for 1941, he concluded. They devised an entire aircraft system for 1945. While we were refining the sword, they were constructing the industrial age." The production miracle. Grumman's manufacturing of the Hellcat itself became a potent weapon. The Bethpage, New York facility operated around the clock, 7 days a week. At the zenith of its production, a new Hellcat emerged from the assembly line every 60 minutes. The company manufactured 12,275 Hellcats in a mere 30 months, an accomplishment the Japanese found incomprehensible. In 1944 alone, Japan produced 5,100 fighters across all models. America, in contrast, manufactured 35,000 fighters that same year. The production system incorporated innovations that appeared miraculous to Japanese observers. Workers utilized color-coded instructions for assembling intricate components. Shifts ran continuously. Quality remained uncompromised despite the rapid pace. The strategic revolution, the Hellcat did more than simply secure victories. It fundamentally reshaped naval aerial combat. Pre-war strategy presumed aircraft carriers were vulnerable platforms necessitating preemptive strikes for survival. The Hellcat reversed this paradigm. Carriers transformed into fortified bastions, capable of absorbing and repelling any aerial assault. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commander of Task Force 58, fully grasped this transformation. "With the Hellcat," he stated, "we no longer need to seek them out first. Let them come to us. The F6F will decimate them at our convenience." This newfound assurance enabled unprecedented offensive operations. American carriers could station themselves off enemy coastlines for extended periods, weeks at a time, their Hellcat umbrellas rendering them virtually impervious to air attacks. The cultural collision. Beyond its technological superiority, the Hellcat represented a cultural philosophy that undermined Japanese military doctrine. The samurai ethos championed individual valor, spiritual fortitude, and the acceptance of death. The Hellcat, however, embodied systematic efficiency, material dominance, and the imperative of preserving life. This fundamental philosophical disparity prevented Japanese pilots from adapting to Hellcat tactics, even when they understood them. The concept of disengaging from combat when at a disadvantage, a cornerstone of Hellcat doctrine, was utterly inconceivable to Japanese pilots indoctrinated in Bushido, the judgment of history. In 1962, the United States Navy convened a symposium on Pacific War aviation. American and Japanese veterans gathered to reflect on the conflict with the benefit of historical perspective. Captain David McCampbell, the Navy's most decorated ace with 34 victories, offered a concise summation. The Hellcat won the Pacific Air War, period. It annihilated Japanese aviation and rendered our victory inevitable. Commander Saburo Sakai responded, "The Zero was a superior fighter. The Hellcat was a superior weapon system. We never comprehended the distinction until it was tragically late. We arrived with swords to a gunfight and pondered our defeat. The ultimate reckoning." The Hellcat's overwhelming advantage can be distilled into simple mathematics that narrate a profound story. The overall kill ratio stood at 19-1, specifically 13-1 against Zeros. 12,275 Hellcats were produced in 30 months. Approximately 6,000 Zeros were manufactured between 1943 and 1945. Over 5,000 American pilots received training on the Hellcat. By August 1945, fewer than 100 Japanese pilots remained combat-ready. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, who had commanded the Japanese fleet at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, provided perhaps the most candid assessment. "We mocked the Hellcat because we failed to recognize it symbolized not merely an aircraft, but an entire civilization's approach to warfare. By the time our laughter ceased, our air forces had vanished. The final word." Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai lived until the year 2000. In his last interview, he was questioned about the Hellcat. His reply encapsulated its absolute dominance. "The Zero elevated Japan to the status of a great naval power. The Hellcat revealed to Japan that it was never as formidable as it perceived. We believed ourselves to be samurai. The Hellcat demonstrated that we were merely men wielding obsolete weaponry against the future. Every Japanese pilot who survived the war owed their lives to a Hellcat pilot's decision to spare them. That represents the ultimate defeat. Existence dictated by your adversary's clemency." The F6F Hellcat entered service weighing twice that of the Zero. It carried armor that the Zero lacked. It was powered by an engine the Japanese could not replicate. It was armed with weapons they could not match, guided by radars they could not detect, flown by pilots they could not equal in skill, and produced in quantities they could not fathom. Japanese pilots had ridiculed it because they failed to grasp that each additional pound represented not a deficiency, but the strength of an industrial democracy that could afford to safeguard its combatants. By the time they understood, their laughter had transformed into farewell letters home, their derision into kamikaze sorties, and their confidence into utter collapse. The Hellcat had not merely triumphed over the Zeros. It had demolished an entire philosophy of combat, proving that in modern warfare, the nation capable of constructing the superior system would inevitably vanquish the nation that could only forge superior warriors. The Japanese pilots had initially laughed at the F6F Hellcat. The Hellcat had the last laugh. It always did.